Welcome to the War Academy channel. Imagine for a moment that you are a general or field marshal during World War II, which I'm sure none of you have ever done. You are then faced with the following situation. The enemy has broken through his line of defense and is now moving into his rear to disrupt his position. From this point you have two options. The first is to panic and order a general withdrawal, or else you can deal with the situation with what you can. Guderian said in his memoirs that there are no desperate situations, but there are desperate men. That said, let's see what strategies we can adopt to close the gap that has just opened in our defensive line. The first thing we have is to carry out a frontal counterattack against the enemy units that have penetrated our sector. This may turn out to be one of the simplest, however, many elements must be taken into account. In the first place, we have to make an assessment of the forces that have penetrated our defenses, and of the units that we ourselves have in the rear. If this comparison is more or less equal, we can carry out this operation. In addition, to be able to carry out this frontal counterattack, we will have to make sure that the breakout flanks are secured, and the enemy only has a narrow sealed space, in which he can only advance or retreat. Likewise, and for this operation to be successful, we will have to have got ahead of the enemy and have detected his concentration of troops in the place with which he will later attack. This will allow us to have sent combat units to said sector, with which to carry out our frontal counterattack quickly. The speed in our response is very important, because we must prevent the enemy from widening the gap and rushing from its flanks. Our mission here would be to carry out a frontal and very concentrated attack, which allows us to obtain a firepower superior to that of the enemy, with which to section off their breakout units. And it is that, despite how powerful our formation may be, the enemy's will always be superior, so we cannot offer them a frontal combat throughout the length of the line. As many will be imagining, this strategy carries many dangers, since our troops can be surrounded in the middle of the enemy units. That is why this operation can only be carried out after great preparation and planning, in which we can count on very powerful combat units. The second option we have to stop an enemy penetration is the flank attack. At first glance, this may be much more feasible than a frontal counterattack, however it carries many dangers. The biggest of them is that during this operation, the defenders who have launched this attack on the enemy flank are subject to being attacked by their own flanks. This is because the enemy may still have a lot of reserves left that they haven't launched into the attack yet, and they can be quickly rushed into the area, and because the vanguard itself can turn around and repel the defender's attack. Furthermore, the Soviet, British, and American armies alike quickly learned the importance of protecting their flanks while launching an attack, and this made these operations very difficult after 1943. Without a doubt, the Germans were experts in counterattacks of all kinds, and after carrying out many operations of this type, the Allies were increasingly cautious and greatly strengthened their penetrating flanks. In conclusion, to carry out these operations, the defender must have a powerful mobile force that allows him to section at full speed the gap that his enemy has opened in his lines. With this he prevents the enemy from reorganizing and redirecting against them. It is estimated that for these operations to be successful, the defender must have at least a third of his enemy's force. If none of these options convinces us, or cannot be applied due to the circumstances of the moment, we can also resort to the disarticulation attack. This consists of getting ahead of your enemy, and dealing a strong blow by surprise in the area of his concentration. In other words, we have to detect the movements of enemy troops, and just when they are grouped and ready to attack us, anticipate their intentions and take advantage of their vulnerability. With this we intend to disorganize our enemy and cause him to either have to delay his attack, or postpone it completely. To be able to do this we need first of all that the enemy does not detect our movements at any time. We also need him not to have good defenses in the area, and for our own forces to have good mobility and firepower. For obvious reasons, it is quite difficult for the right conditions to be given so that this type of operation can go well. A clear example of this could have been during the Battle of Kursk in 1943. The Soviets could have anticipated the German attack and attacked it in its concentration areas. However, it was more profitable for the Germans to get bogged down in their defensive lines and then go on to counterattack in many places. The fourth option we have is the pincer defensive move. This strategy was one of the most chosen by the German generals because it was very effective and required a reduced number of troops. It basically consists of attacking the enemy penetration line from both flanks, which would quickly allow the open gap to be closed. With this, the enemy vanguard units will be isolated and without supplies. The key to this tactic is their coordination and speed, as they must cut the enemy gap and make contact with each other before the enemy can react. It is important that both groups attack simultaneously, so as not to allow the enemy to concentrate on one of their flanks, to later move on to the other. Again, for this operation to succeed, the defenders must have strong units in their rear that can quickly deploy to both points of the enemy penetration, and cut through it at full speed, and forcefully. If you liked none of the above, we are going to explain another classic example of defense below, which can be very effective. This method consists of carrying out a defense in depth with mobile reserves. For this we must build defensive lines in our sector in a staggered manner. We can establish 3 or 4 lines of trenches at a distance of a few kilometers between them, in which the enemy gradually wears down as he advances. This will give us time to bring in some mobile units, which will attack the weakest points of the enemy. Unfortunately for the Germans, their defensive lines were becoming thinner, and they could not establish defenses in depth, since a division had to take charge of up to 40 kilometers of front. This leads us to the fact that the weak defensive lines were penetrated with relative ease by the Soviets, and there was no time to hold them and attack them with other mobile reserves. A good example of this type of defense can be found by the Soviets in Kursk, or by the Germans in East Prussia. Although these tactics that we have just seen have as their objective to close the enemy gap and restore the situation, the ones that we are going to see next only intend to delay the enemy, since closing the gap is impossible due to the weakness of the defender. The first that we can resort to is that of the famous fortress cities. In them, the defender tries to resist in fortified positions of greater or lesser value, in a desperate attempt to stop the enemy offensive. This was a tactic that Germany resorted to mainly after 1944, due to the lack of troops with which to garrison a continuous line, and the lack of powerful mobile units. With this it is intended that the enemy offensive is stuck in the different sieges of these fortress cities, and is deprived of road intersections of all kinds, which in theory, will lead to a much slower advance. The next option is known as zone defense, which was widely used by generals like Raus or Heinrici. As we saw in other programs such as the Battle of the Silo Hills, this tactic consists of a series of withdrawals and counterattacks, playing with previously prepared defensive positions. To give us an idea, we are talking about a kind of flexible defense on a small scale, in which units are withdrawn before the enemy artillery attack, and once the enemy attacks, they take their units by some points where the terrain has been mined, and where the defenders have an advantage. Subsequently, counterattacks are carried out against the worn-out enemy vanguards, until the initial defensive position is recovered, or in any case, as close to it as possible. These are some of the defensive tactics that you can use as a general, although of course there are many more in this siege book that I read a long time ago and that I recommend. In any case, and although each of them must be applied in a certain circumstance, which one did you like the most? I recommend you watch the program again so that now, with a more global vision, you can better understand what each of them consisted of and what their differences are. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.